diuretic.
Okay, so this is the last lecture right before exam. Last one, chapter 4 in your book, energy expenditure and fatigue. Alright. Have you, I'm not sure in your lab yet in terms of the syllabus, I can't recall, have you looked at VO2 yet in lab?
No.
You measured VO2 max, VO2 two ways of measuring energy costs of exercise. One is direct calorimetry, which we briefly discussed, measures the body's heat production to estimate energy expenditure. And the other method that you'll certainly see in lab on a number of occasions is indirect calorimetry. And that calculates energy expenditure as the ratio of carbon dioxide produced to CO2 consumed by the body, right? We refer to that as the RER, the respiratory exchange ratio. So here we're looking at gases, okay? Gas exchange, which you'll do in lab. You'll see RER again on a number of occasions. Respiratory exchange ratio, okay? And that's indirect calorimetry. And we're predominantly going to be talking about indirect calorimetry. We're going to briefly mention that on the next slide. Direct calorimetry. This requires a room, okay? Some exercise biochemistry labs around the world have these. My last institution did. It's completely insulated. We can have somebody, we can put somebody in there, they can sleep in there, they can walk on it, they can run on a treadmill, work out the glycometer, okay? Like I said, it's completely sealed. It's surrounded by water as well. And we have cold water entering. And we have warm water leaving. The reason it's warm is because the heat from the body is warming the water. Okay? Obviously, we also have a CO2 absorber to absorb the CO2 that's produced by the person. Okay? There's air in, air out. But the important thing is the water is being warm. And that's a measure of heat exchange. And it's also a measure of a subject's metabolic rate. Okay? And we don't have time in this class to go through it, but there's various equations that will, if you like, determine the metabolic rate for that particular person based on how much that person heats the water. Okay? So we can calculate metabolic rate based on that. It's very, very accurate. Okay? An indirect way of looking at metabolic rate calculate oxygen consumption. So this is now indirect calorimetry. So this was direct calorimetry, right? Now we talk about indirect calorimetry. Okay? By calculating oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you're going to see this again in lab. Okay, all this you're going to see in lab. JJ and Blair will go through this with you again. So what we're going to do, what you will do lab is calculate VO2. So that V dot stands for volume, right? Volume of O2 consumed, VCO2 produced. And that requires us to know a certain number of things. The volume of air inspired, that's VI. The volume of air expired, VE. The fraction of O2 in inspired air, which is denoted FiO2. If you're down here at sea level, what do you think the fraction of O2 in inspired air that you're breathing at the moment? Let's say it's a percentage. What's that? Higher compared to anything more? Oh, you mean altitude? Yeah, you don't? Okay, you're going to withdraw that statement. We will be talking about that again when we talk about altitude physiology, right? Whether it's high or low. So you're just sitting here at the moment. What's the percentage of oxygen you're breathing at sea level? What you on?
20%?
20.93%. Rounded up to 21%. Okay. The fraction of O2 in inspired air is actually denoted as a decimal, so it's 0.2093. 0.2. Okay. Nitrogen's around 79%, isn't it? 0.79. carbon dioxide about 0.03%. That's what we mean by the fraction of O2 in the inspired air is denoted as a decimal, okay, of the percentage. So then you have fraction of CO2 inspired air, FI CO2, then in the inspired air, FeO2, and so forth. Okay. Now, if you really wanted to determine the VO2, oxygen consumed, the volume of oxygen consumed, liters per minute, you could determine it by knowing the VI. Okay, if you remember the VI is the volume of air inspired. That's difficult to determine, not next to impossible to determine. Okay, the volume of inspired. Okay, so the volume of air inspired is very, very difficult to determine, if not impossible. You know that FiO2, that's 21%, right, sea level. You could certainly calculate, you could determine VE, which is called the minute ventilation. Okay, VE is the volume of air inspired. I can measure that. Just measure the volume per minute. And the FeO2. Okay. And you can do the same for ECO2. So the big ones here, VI is pretty much impossible to measure. Okay? But there is a way around it. We'll talk about that. The equipment used to measure O2 consumption, CO2 production in the lab and the field, you'll see equipment similar to this and this, using a metabolic cart we have in the labs. And then we've got some Kenyan runners here using a portable little metabolic cart called a Cosmic K4. It's made out of Italy. Okay, and they're measuring VO2. Okay, in the field. Okay. So again, Blair and JJ will talk about the Haldane transformation. Haldane is a famous British physiologist who came up with this transformation. We know that three gases that make up inspired air, I've spoken about them: oxygen, FiO2, 21.93%, carbon dioxide, 0.03% actually, and nitrogen, 79%. Okay? Now, rather than go through all this, is that this Haldane transformation, okay? We can go through, you can go through this on your own if you want, because you're probably going to have to do it in the lab. We can go through all this substitution of these various equations that we saw previously here. Okay? And we're going to end up with an equation down here that I've bolded that looks at VO2, the volume of oxygen inspired, okay, as a consequence of minute ventilation times 1 minus FeO2, fraction expired O2 plus a fraction expired CO2 times a constant 0.265 minus a fraction expired O2. You'll see that what's happening here is we are trying to determine VO2 in liters per minute, which is the amount of oxygen consumed. And it's all as a function of all these expired values, right? Minute ventilation VE we can measure in the lab very easily. The fraction expired O2 we can measure in the lab very easily as we can CO2, and here is the fraction expired O2. Okay? And this is actually the equation that the computer in the metabolic cart uses, breath by breath, to determine VO2. Volume of oxygen inspired in liters per minute equals these guys here. Okay? That's what the computer calculates. Okay, so you'll see that again with JJ and Blair, okay, the Haldane transformation. Respiratory exchange ratio. Ratio between, I just mentioned it, the ratio between CO2 released VCO2, oxygen consumed, and we can express it as a ratio here, VCO2 divided by VO2. So again, we can measure VCO2, which is the amount of CO2 produced, okay, measured in litres per minute. We can measure, because of the Haldane transformation, the oxygen consumed, that's the VO2 in litres per minute. You divide VCO2 litres per minute by VO2 litres per minute, we get a dimensionless number. Again, the computer, the metabolic part, will compute these RERs, breath by breath, as you work, as you're on the treadmill or on the bike, okay? And at rest, you guys just sit there at the moment listening to me, the RER value is somewhere between 0.78 and 0.80, okay? Now, that RER, the respiratory exchange ratio, is determined by your substrate utilization. So you at the moment predominantly are burning fat, just listening to me, okay? But it takes a lot more oxygen, as you know, as I mentioned before, to burn fat. Okay, 23 O2 is compared to carbohydrate, which is 6 moles of O2. But we know fat generates more ATP, 129 ATP, depending on the fat, say, compared to oxidative phosphorylation, which is about 38 ATPs. So we divide the carbohydrate, RER, VCO2 divided by VO2, we get 6 moles of CO2 divided by 6 O2s, gives you an RER of around about 1. This is just an example. The fat, VCO2 again divided by VO2, that's 16 CO2 divided by 23 O2s, gives you an RER of about 0.70. So when you're burning fat, your RER is lower. Okay? So, RER during exercise in particular gives us an idea on the predominant substrate that you're using. And again, the computer will churn this out real time for us. Okay? So as your exercise intensity increases, your RER is going to increase. Okay? Your RER is going to increase. So it's got an example here. This is out of your book. An RER of 0.71 is saying your carbohydrates are 0 and your fat's 100. That never ever occurs. You never burn 0 carbohydrates. This is just an example, okay? And by the time you get to an RER of 1, you're burning 100 RERs, which is 0 fat. Again, that doesn't occur. Okay? So also, when you reach an RER of 1, it tells us that you're pretty much at maximum exercise. You're burning a tremendous amount of carbohydrates. So that's an indicator, among others, to suggest to us as the investigator, when you're on that treadmill or that bike ergometer, and your RER is either close to 1, you're getting near maximum exercise. Okay? So it's a good indicator to us. We can look at your VO2, we can look at your RER, we can look at lactate, which we'll talk about coming up, we can look at other markers, we can listen to your breath, determine whether you're close to maximum exercise. So RER gives us a good idea also on the substrate utilization of your close to maximum exercise. Okay? Okay, that's just the key points for calorimetry. Let me read those. Okay, talk about resting metabolic rate. Okay, so the resting metabolic rate is the minimum amount of energy required by the body to sustain basic cellular function. It's dependent upon fat-free mass and body surface area. If your fat mass increases, your resting metabolic rate is going to increase. So more obese people, for instance, right, have a higher resting metabolic rate compared to someone who's more lean. Okay? Ranges from about 1,100 to 2,500 kilocalories per day. And obviously, when your activity is added in, your daily caloric intake can be anything from 1,700 even up to 5,000 kilocalories per day. Okay? What will affect resting metabolic rate? Exercise. If you go for a 100-mile bike ride yesterday, your resting metabolic rate is going to be increased today compared to what it would normally be. There's a variety of reasons for that. It's usually hormonal. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are still elevated. They will still increase your heart rate. They will still increase lipolysis. So you're still burning fat to a slight degree. Carbohydrate oxidation still increasing. Your resting metabolic rate increase. Okay, so those factors then that affect the resting metabolic rate: age. Resting metabolic rate gradually decreases with age. Why? Because of a decrease in fat generally, decrease in fat-free mass. Body temperature. Resting metabolic rate increases with increase in temperature. Psychological stress increases activity of the sympathetic nervous system. That plays into the hormones. Okay, I've already mentioned about going for a 100-mile bike ride yesterday. Is that going to affect your resting metabolic rate? Yes. Because of hormones, cortisol, the thyroid hormones, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Still going to be slightly elevated. Okay. Okay, what about metabolic rate then during sub-maximal exercise? And certainly metabolism, of course, increases in direct proportion to the increase in exercise intensity. If you increase your exercise intensity, metabolism, of course, is going to increase. Okay. During exercise at constant power output, that's what we mean by this sub-maximal exercise, right? Constant, this is talk about cycling, constant power output or work rate. VO2 will increase from its resting value to a steady state within about 1 to 2 minutes. Okay. And there is a linear increase in the VO2 with increases in power output. So you're going to see something like this. Okay, this is out of your textbook. So what we have here is on the left we have oxygen consumption or oxygen uptake in liters per minute, up to 4 liters per minute. And here obviously we have the time of the, where we have 5 minutes, let's say 5 minutes of exercise. Okay? So if you have someone on a bike ergometer and they're only working out at 50 watts, which is not a lot, okay, they're going to hit their steady state very, very quickly. And in this case, after about 1.25 minutes, they've reached a steady state in terms of oxygen consumption. And so from say 1.25 minutes to 5 minutes, their oxygen consumption is not going to change. It's very easy. Okay? You start, and then you increase to 100 watts for another person, and it's going to take about 2 minutes to reach their steady state. Steady state VO2. You go up to 150 watts, it's about 5 minutes. Okay, 200 watts, it's going to be about 2.75 minutes perhaps, and even up to 250 watts, it may be 3 minutes before you reach the steady state. Okay. Here's the linear increase here, so we have the blood lactate over here, here's the VO2, there's a linear increase in VO2, here's the blood lactate response. Very, very low exercise intensities, around about, say, 50 watts, there's not much of a change in terms of blood lactate. After about 50 watts, blood lactate will increase in a little bit of a curvilinear fashion here as exercise increases. We're going into more of an anaerobic situation. Because what happens with anaerobic glycolysis, right? What's the end product of anaerobic glycolysis? Lactate. Pyruvate is converted to lactate. And the actual lactate dehydrogenates, right? And little pyruvate is being converted into acetyl-CoA, right? Theta pyruvate under anaerobic glycolysis is being converted into lactic acid. Okay? And for someone who's not accustomed to 300 watts of exercise, that's absolutely an anaerobic situation, right? So that, if you like, a steady state exercise, VO2, okay, represents energy cost for that specific power output. Okay? All right. Question is, does that really occur? Does that really occur? Well, yes and no. At the low power outputs, yes. 50 and even 100 watts, okay, we do reach a true steady state, which you see here. Okay? At around about, say, 150 watts for a person who's not accustomed to this type of exercise, we start to see an upward shift in oxygen consumption. So we don't see a true steady state. And it's even more plain here at 200 watts. This is what we showed in the last slide. In fact, what really occurs is this. You don't reach a true steady state. So the question is, what's going on? Well, this rise in VO2 here above the steady state is called the slow component of oxygen uptake kinetics. It continually rises, okay? And it's been postulated that it's due to the recruitment of fast twitch muscle fibers. As you can imagine, when if you're not accustomed to this sort of exercise, when you're up around 150 to 200 watts, you're very much going into an anaerobic situation. You're using more fast twitch muscle fibers. Those fast twitch muscle fibers require higher oxygen consumption than slow twitch muscle fibers, of course. So because of that, then, your oxygen consumption is going to continually increase. So you don't reach that true steady state that you would reach at the lower power outputs when you're predominantly using the slower twitch muscle fibers. You're not activating the fast twitch muscle fibers here. Okay? And you can see that there it will also, rather than seeing that nice linear increase in VO2, it starts to veer off. Okay, seen this term before, maximal oxygen uptake. In other classes, you will be measuring this with Blair and JJ in the lab. We can measure it in a number of ways. We can put someone on the treadmill. I'll take them to the next slide. We can put them on a bike ergometer using the various protocols and take them to maximum exercise. Okay, it is a measure of the maximal capacity for oxygen consumption by the body during obviously maximal exertion. You know, VO2 max. It is probably the single best measurement of cardiorespiratory endurance and aerobic fitness. It certainly increases with physical training up to a point, but it's set by your genetics. That's important. Okay? We can increase it, probably up to around about 10%, then you're done. It's set very much by genetics, VO2 max. In the lab, we measure it as liters per minute, but we can convert it to mLs per kg per minute to standardize it to body weight. Okay. Normally, what we say, active, untrained college-age students, typical VO2s values would be somewhere between around 38 to 42 mLs per kg per minute. Unfortunately, it does decline as you get older, after about 25 to 30, about 1% per year. And as you may be aware, in some very elite athletes, some of the Nordic, Scandinavian cross-country skiers, we've seen values up to 92, which is very, very rare. Even elite Tour de France cyclists will be values in the high 70s, maybe low 80s. Okay. We have had some fairly elite cross-country runners here in the lab from the IU team, and they've been around 76, 78, which is good. This is a graph out of your book here looking at the relationship of exercise intensity and oxygen consumption in trained and untrained men, simply showing that obviously in the difference between a trained and untrained individual, that you expect a trained individual to go longer and have higher oxygen uptake compared to an untrained individual. There's nothing rocket science about that particular graph, right? All right. So really, in terms of that VO2, maximum oxygen uptake, it's really, you could argue that it's really what it's measuring is aerobic power. Or aerobic capacity. It's also known as your maximum aerobic capacity. effort. The question is, how do we measure an anaerobic effort? Okay. Well, we know that we've already spoken about oxygen consumption requires several minutes to reach a true steady state. Okay. We'll talk about and bring into the lecture the term oxygen deficit. Okay, oxygen deficit is calculated as the difference between the oxygen required for a given exercise intensity and the actual oxygen consumption. So, this anaerobic effort can be estimated by examining what we call the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC, which, if you like, is the mismatch between oxygen consumption and energy requirement. So, here on the graph, here is your oxygen deficit. So, if you look at oxygen consumption, here's your resting oxygen consumption, right here. You started exercise, you're going to reach a steady state after a certain time, say 2 minutes. Okay, then we terminate exercise. Okay, and you're going to see something. You're going to see obviously a return at some point from the oxygen consumption, but it's not immediate, right? We term that the excess post-exercise consumption, oxygen consumption. Here is your oxygen deficit, difference between the O2 required for a given rate of work and the O2 actually consumed. Okay. So we can use this EPOC to estimate the anaerobic effort, right here. How long does it take to recover back to baseline in terms of oxygen consumption? Is the effort recovery right here. So what are the factors that are responsible for this EPOC right here? Well, rebuilding depleted ATP and phosphocreatine stores, clearing lactate produced by anaerobic metabolism, replenishing O2 supplies borrowed from hemoglobin, which, as you know, binds oxygen, and myoglobin. Hemoglobin is in blood, myoglobin is in muscle. Myoglobin also binds oxygen in muscle. We'll talk about myoglobin again. Okay. Removing CO2 that is accumulated in body tissues and increased metabolic and respiratory rates due to increased body temperature are all responsible for how quickly your VO2 returns to resting value. So, if you're undergoing a high anaerobic effort, would you say that it would take longer for your EPOC to come back down to normal? What do you think? Let's say I put you on a bike, 200 watts, 300 watts. Tell you to go for it. You go for maximum exercise, let's say. Okay? And I measure your EPOC. I see how quickly your VO2 returns to normal. And then I bring you back the next day and put you on the bike at 50 watts, which is very easy. Do the same thing. I'm not taking the maximum exercise, right? And then I'm going to measure your VO2 and see how quickly it returns to exercise. Which one is it going to? Which one of those exercise passes is going to take longer for your VO2 to return after exercise to normal values? The anaerobic effort, right? The strenuous exercise. It's going to remain elevated. It's going to remain elevated because of all these factors that we mentioned, and hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, etc. Okay. Okay. That's kind of factor responsible for EPOC. That's kind of one way how we can actually monitor and measure your anaerobic effort. Okay, looking at your EPOC. Okay, lactate threshold. You probably have heard this term before. Used a lot in the scientific literature and the layman literature in magazines. Used wrongly most of the time. You've also heard the term probably anaerobic threshold. Those terms are used interchangeably with lactate threshold. Okay, in the graduate level of exercise biochemistry, I spent a whole lecture on the lactate anaerobic threshold and what it all means, basically. I spent a whole lecture on this. But for now, we'll use the term lactate threshold. Okay? But it also can mean the anaerobic threshold. But in general, there's a point at which blood lactate begins to accumulate, okay, in the blood above resting levels during exercise or increasing exercise exercise intensity. So as your exercise intensity increases, you're going to become slightly more anaerobic. Pyruvic is going to be converted to lactate. Lactate is going to enter in the blood. Remember that blood lactate concentration, what we measure in the blood, when we assay it in the blood, okay, it's a balance between lactate production and lactate clearance from the muscle. Right? So blood lactate is being produced in the muscle. It's going into blood. We're measuring it in blood. So it's a balance between what's being produced by the muscle and what's being cleared out of the blood. Okay? We usually measure it as millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. Okay? Okay. The lactate threshold is also usually expressed as a percentage of VO2 max. And a high lactate threshold can indicate potential for better endurance performance. On the downside, lactate accumulation can cause fatigue. Although we'll talk about exactly what is causing fatigue. Is it lactate? Is it not? Okay. Okay. And you're going to do a blood lactate lab. I have written a lab for you guys to do, where we'll put someone on either the treadmill or the bike. Okay? Have you running and then increase the speed of the treadmill. And as we increase, every time we increase the speed of the treadmill, after every 3 minutes, we're going to have the person straddle the treadmill, okay? And we're going to take a capillary blood sample and assay it for lactate. And as you expect, as that person's increasing their speed, their blood lactate is going to go up, right? That would make sense. And that's what we've got here, right? Blood lactate millimoles per liter here, graphed up against treadmill speed. And in this particular person, once this person's reached almost 12 kilometers per hour, after that we see a dramatic increase in blood lactate. And at demarcation point, we turn the lactate threshold, or as I've said before, some researchers call it the anaerobic threshold, with the lactate threshold. Okay? So after this point, it is assumed that we're hitting into anaerobic metabolism. A lot of pyruvate is converted to lactate. Okay? Before that, we're predominantly aerobic. Okay? All right. So then, we can do one of two things. Either during this test, we can also measure VO2. Okay? Or we may know the VO2 from a previous test. And if we know the person's VO2 max, sometimes we don't know the person's VO2 max. What we could do is take this person to maximum exercise. So we'll take lactate 3 minutes. After every 3 minutes, we'll change up the speed. And then we'll take them to max exercise and determine their VO2 max. So we'll have to determine their VO2 max and we'll determine their lactate threshold. Okay. And then what we can do then is express the lactate threshold as a percentage of VO2 max. So what we'll see then becomes, so this is lactate, millimoles per liter. This is VO2, increasing speed, and we're going to see something like this, right? Just like that graph we had before. Let's determine that that's the lactate threshold at some VO2, right? And at some lactate level, let's say 6 millimoles per liter. The question is that enough is that good information to tell an athlete or a coach that this is where the VO2 is? Sorry, this is where the lactate threshold is. You're going to tell that coach that it occurs at, say, 2.8 liters per minute.
VO2. Is that useful information to an athlete? So you're the coaches and the athlete, right? You're the coach or the athlete, and I said to you, yeah, your lactate threshold has occurred at 6 millimoles per litre and at a VO2 of 2.8 litres per minute. Does that mean anything to you? Is that going to help you training? No. And I might even say that what may help somewhat is I might say, since we know what your VO2 max is, okay, which is say here, I can then say that it occurred at 78% of your VO2 max. Do you think that's useful information? Somewhat. But as an athlete or a coach, there's other information I could give you, right? What other dependent variables could I measure during an exercise bout? Because that could be, if you're a cyclist, I know there's one cyclist over there. If you're on the road, what information would be really useful to you in terms of training? Power output. If you have a power meter, right? A lot of cyclists now have power meters. So what I could do, if this was an exercise bout, I could measure power output in watts. Right? I might say, okay, now that your lactate threshold has occurred at 210 watts, now that means something. Now I can take that information out on the road and I can actually, if you like, determine my training around my lactate threshold. So when I go out on, let's say, an endurance ride, for instance, it might be that I need to keep my my long ride, my 100-mile ride, for instance, at around about 60% of my lactate threshold power output. Or when I race an Ironman, 112 miles, I need to keep it well below the lactate threshold, because we all train with power meters now, right? So that's a cyclist. How about a runner? Well, they don't have the luxury of power outputs. But you can buy watches now, right? Garmin's. So we could measure that, we could determine the pace or heart rate. Heart rate would be a really good one to measure, right? So I could say that your lactate threshold now has been determined, and it sits at let's say 168 beats per minute. That's your heart rate and your lactate threshold. And then, but you're never going to keep it at 168, so you usually give them like a 5-beat margin, say I don't know, 163, 5. Let's say 165. Let's say it's about 170. That's your lactate threshold heart rate zone. So again, when you go out to the track and do your intervals, 800-meter intervals or 400-meter intervals, you keep it somewhere within there. You don't go above it. So that's one thing. The other thing is then I might have other times that you come in and I've tested you. It might be at the beginning of the season I come in and determine that your lactate threshold is occurring at 78% of VO2 max. I bring you in midway through the season and now you're at 83% of VO2 max. You're fitter. Training's working. This can also be a good indicator of overtraining as well. Okay? I used to train in the old days, a long time ago, with Olympic athletes, lactate threshold testing, and sometimes if they're overtrained or underperforming, their lactate threshold is depressed. So along with other factors, that's a good indicator that something's wrong, and then you take time off. Okay? So anyway, so yes, heart rate, power output, other indicators, okay, are useful. All right, what's the fate of lactate? I want to talk about, very briefly, the lactate shuttle and the Cori cycle. Okay, we know that the lactate shuttle, okay, well what the lactate shuttle means is, where's lactate coming from predominantly? Fast twitch muscle fibers, right? Obviously. Those are the fibers that you're going to be predominantly recruiting during anaerobic effort. Okay? So what we've got here in
in this diagram, we've got the muscle tissue, or muscle here. We've got a fast twitch or fast glycolytic fiber. We've got a slow oxidative fiber right here on the right. It is the fast glycolytic fiber that is going to be producing lactate. Predominantly. That goes into blood. Blood goes to the heart, right? The heart loves lactate. It oxidizes lactate. Any lactate coming to the heart, it will start to burn it. It will start to oxidize it. Any left over will come back down, and the slow twitch muscle fibers can consume the lactate for fuel. Will oxidize the lactate. So it's produced by the fast twitch muscle fibers. The heart will oxidize it, as will the slow twitch muscle fibers as well. And that's what we mean, obviously, by the term of lactate shuttling around the body. Okay? So it's not a waste product. Okay? It's very useful to the body. Okay, on the right here, the Cori cycle. What we got here is, again, there's the muscle producing the lactate along with pyruvate. The lactate and pyruvate can move into blood. Okay? And the liver will take up the lactate and the pyruvate, and and if we don't need it in the blood, it can be converted to glucose and stored as glycogen. And if we do need it, it can be broken back down to glycogen, glucose, and moved back into the blood, and then back to the same muscle. Okay? That process, as you know, we spoke about it before, is called gluconeogenesis. The making of carbohydrates, if you like, from non-carbohydrate sources. Gluconeogenesis is occurring in the liver. Okay. Okay, this is a graph editing book. I don't think I want to spend much time on this because we can measure it. We don't do it in this lab, but we do it at the grad level. We can measure actually running economy. This is simply saying that obviously the more economical you are, the less oxygen that you need. Okay? So in this case, right, who is the more economical runner? Runner A or runner B? At any given speed. Runner B. Right? And that's what you'd expect to see. Okay? Okay, those are the key points. Now I want to finish off with fatigue. Fatigue and its causes. Okay. We'll also be spending another lecture, probably in about 2 weeks, on central fatigue. But this is kind of by way of an introduction. It'll be more peripheral fatigue. Is there a peripheral fatigue? Contentious issue. Okay. So, in terms of the definition, a general definition, fatigue can be understood as a sensation of being tired, seems reasonable, and obviously decrements in muscular performance, for whatever reason. Okay? So it can be understood as a sensation of being tired, decrements in muscular performance. In terms of a scientific definition, it is failure to generate or maintain the required or expected force or power output resulting from muscular activity, and it is reversible by rest. Okay? So it's a failure to generate or maintain the required or expected force or power output. The purpose of fatigue. What is important here is to understand it's not a negative process. It's a protective process. So it's commonly assumed that it's a negative process. No, it's not. It's a protective process. It serves to down-regulate output to prevent a catastrophic metabolic crisis. Okay, that's really important. Okay. It can also serve to temporarily preserve exercise economy at sustainable rates. So you bring your speed down, but you might continue to run, so that you can maintain muscular efficiency. Okay? So it's very much a protective mechanism. Okay, fatigue and its postulated causes. Energy delivery. So phosphocreatine stores are depleted. ATP stores are depleted. Okay? Lactate's being produced along with lots of hydrogen ions. Okay? That's what we mentioned in bullet number 2, accumulation of metabolic byproducts such as lactate and hydrogen ions. I'll tell you right now, it's not the lactate per se that causes fatigue, it's the hydrogen ions that are generated from lactate being produced that are responsible for fatigue. That's also very important. Lactate is very much an inert substance. It doesn't do anything. If you infuse it into blood in animal models, it doesn't do anything. It's the hydrogen ions generated from the production of lactate that are responsible, if you like, for slowing down glycolysis, interfering with excitation, contraction, coupling. That's what I mean by number 3, failure of the muscle fibers contractile mechanism. That's due generally to the accumulation of the protons or the hydrogen ions. And alteration in the nervous system we'll come back to a little bit briefly later on, but also in a whole lecture we'll talk about the central nervous system and how that may play a role in fatigue. Okay, so I spoke about, in terms of those energy system fatigue, phosphocreatine depletion, glycogen depletion, if you like hitting the wall, say in a marathon. We're talking about glycogen depletion from type 1 and 2 fibers, depends on the duration and intensity of the activity, of course. Okay? And remember, glycogen depletion is selective to the muscle groups involved in the activity. So the muscles that you use going up a hill, running, compared to down a hill, are going to be different. Right? Here's an example here of a histochemical staining after a 30-kilometer run. And you can see before the run, there's your fast twitch muscle fibers. Here's your slow twitch muscle fibers are black. Okay? Meaning, with the slow twitch muscle fibers that you're predominantly using in a marathon, for instance, or a 30-kilometer run, which is 18 miles, before the run, plenty of it. After the run, fully depleted. There's no cobalt being deposited at all. So after that 30-kilometer run, your slow twitch muscle fibers are completely depleted, and even some of your faster fibers are on their way. They become very pink. Okay? I've just spoken about the glycogen depletion in different muscle groups, depends on your muscle, depends on what you're doing. Say, for instance, glycogen used here, uphill running, downhill running, etc., etc. Recall also that high muscle temperature impairs skeletal muscle function and metabolism. This was some data here back in 1997 looking at time to exhaustion in minutes and exercising in different temperatures, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 51 degrees, 70 degrees, and 87 degrees. And it seems that 51 degrees Fahrenheit, these individuals that were able to go longer, certainly than 38, 70 degrees, and 87. Okay. Too high a muscle temperature, as you know, I've spoken about it before, you start to denature enzymes. Okay. Thermoregulation is going to start to play a factor here, certainly at 7 degrees, right? The time to absorption is going to be up. You're going to start to lose plasma volume. Okay, so the metabolic byproducts. Already mentioned short duration activities depend on anaerobic glycolysis. When you're going through anaerobic glycolysis, you're going to produce a lot of lactate and proton hydrolytes, right? I said that already, but protons are responsible mainly for peripheral fatigue, but those protons need to be buffered. We can't just leave them around the blood, right? So how do we buffer them? By carbonate. Bicarbonate in the blood will buffer the hydrolytes generated from the production of lactate. Again, it's about keeping the cell pH between 6.4, which is actually exhaustion, is 7.1. pH lower than 6.9 slows glycolysis and ATP production. And when you reach about 6.4, those protons inhibit glycolysis, resulting in exhaustion. We do this in the lab at the graduate level. Again, we assay on a treadmill. We assay bicarbonate and lactate. You see protons. You see in terms of bicarbonate levels in the blood will go down because they're buffering hydrolytes as you increase exercise intensity. Okay. This is another graph out of the book here looking at muscle pH and sprint. Very quick sprint. So you started out almost at 7.1, the muscle pH. You've gone down to about 6.55. At the end of that, probably that 12-second sprint. Yet it can take up to 35 minutes for your pH to come back to normal. Okay, 35 minutes during the recovery period. In terms of neuromuscular fatigue, it may be a result of decreased release or synthesis of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, hyperactive or hypoactive acetylcholine esterase. What's acetylcholine esterase? You heard of it before? Physiology. ACE meaning gives it away. It's an enzyme, right? Enzyme, and it breaks down acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction, in the synaptic web, enabling it to be recycled. So we may have too much of it or too little of it. It may be, number 4, there may be increased threshold for stimulation of the muscle fiber. So it's going to take a bigger stimulus to reach threshold. Number 5, competition with acetylcholine for receptors on the muscle membrane. There might be some sort of inhibitor of unknown origin. So that means. Number 6, potassium may leave the intracellular space, decreasing the membrane potential below resting levels, taking it further away from threshold. Okay. And central nervous system fatigue may also play a role. We're going to talk about that a lot coming up. Okay, so those are those key points. And the last slide, I believe, this is the last slide, is a paper came out about 5 or 6 years ago. It's called this is actually out of the New York Times. It's actually does the job. And they wrote an article on it called A New Explanation for Muscle Fatigue. Basically, scientists at Columbia University basically postulate that muscle contraction and relaxation are controlled by the release and storage of calcium ions within muscle fibers. And these scientists said that muscle fatigue, largely misunderstood for decades, is caused by calcium leaking into muscle cells. So you know during muscle contraction, the one on the left, right, we have calcium ions being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right, into the cell by an component. You know that. And we get, because of that, we then get muscle contraction. What they're saying is that perhaps calcium ions are leaking out from the sarcoplasmic reticulum during relaxation and still binding to troponin. So there's these leaky channels. That's what these are. The leaky channels. They're actually called lyanogen receptors that are releasing or leaking out a small amount of calcium, still binding troponin, and we get a little bit of contraction. Okay? And then we're tiring the muscle, so to speak. Okay? So that's what they mean basically. Tired muscle, calcium, these channels leak these calcium ions, therefore weakening contractions. Normally you wouldn't see any calcium being released, but they're saying in tired muscles there's a little bit of calcium still being released by the troponin and getting some minute contractions.